Welcome to our podcast. Let's Make History Together is dedicated to Springfield, Ohio. We are a coalition of community members who are actively shaping a new, bold vision for our city. We are doing so through an initiative called Springfield 2051.
Welcome to the Springfield 2051 podcast series. My name is Kevin Rose. I'm the historian at the Turner Foundation here in Springfield, Ohio. I'm also a steering committee member with Springfield 2051. I'm joined today by David Beurle with Future IQ. Welcome, David.
Hello, Kevin.
And Dr. Raphael Allen, the Director of Community Outreach and Engagement at the Springfield Foundation.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. So the project where we're at right now is we've identified 7 pillars. And our pillars, these are strategic pillars that we see as our building blocks for our roadmap forward. And today we're here just to talk about one of those pillars, and it's fostering strong neighborhoods and community well-being, which is a broad pillar. There's a lot of important stuff and a lot of things we've been hearing in our listening sessions that have gone into this. But ultimately, it's about trying to find the working groups that we think that can really tackle these. And neighborhoods and well-being are so closely connected. David, when we hear people talk about neighborhoods, they are more than just geographic areas. They are geographic areas, but they're broader than that. There's things that unite people. What do you think in Springfield that you've seen in your experience here makes neighborhoods healthy and feel connected?
Okay, yeah. So let me first just talk a little about neighborhoods and why I think they're important. I think if you look at social systems and sort of society and how we work, scale's really important. And, Springfield's a big enough city that you don't necessarily always feel immediately connected to the city, but you can feel a real sense of connection and belonging at a neighborhood level. And that's what a lot of people are really looking for. And I think neighborhoods are a tool that you can use to think about, okay, how do we create these senses of belonging or, places that are distinctive within a fabric of a fairly large, small city like Springfield. So I think neighborhoods are a really important part of social structure. If you look at how they are reflected in Springfield, there is a lot of history on neighborhoods here, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And some of those neighborhoods have done well and some have felt like they've been left out. And so I think really focusing our conversations as we develop the roadmap at a neighborhood level as part of the process is going to be important because we want to understand what's important to people, where they're at, and the type of community they want to create around them. We're obviously doing it at the level of Springfield, but it's also really important to do it at a level that is more tangible to people. And I think some of the pieces about wellness and well-being that you talked about, I think there's some really exciting opportunities here in terms of, you have a backbone of a trail network which provides a really interesting connectivity. A lot of people have highlighted that through the listening sessions, the sense of amenities that are here. And I think the honest truth is too that a focus on well-being is important here because Springfield as a community is behind where it should be on some health metrics. You can look at the data and there is clearly a portion of the population that is not as healthy as it could be or probably would want to be, right? And so thinking about how you can build the lifestyle for people at that scale that they live, neighborhood level, and then how do you get between neighborhoods and so on, I think is a really interesting conversation. It tracks really well too with where macro trends are in terms of how people want to live in cities and emerging social values. So I think there's a lot of stuff to dig into here. And I look forward to this. And I think particularly about the history of neighborhoods here and how they're distinct.
Yeah, it was one of those things that came up early in this process. We were having those discussions because people would reference the statistics or the news articles about Springfield being the unhappiest city, right? This is like 15 years ago, but people would reference it. And I remember people saying, well, that's clickbait. It's not real news. We're like, what is it? And we dug deep and it was real news. Unhappiest is in some ways a thing. They grouped a bunch of metrics together, but they were real data that they had surveyed people. And when they were looking at the data, Springfielders were unhappy. There were high levels of obesity. There was levels of disengagement. But these were things we could solve, right? So we first realized it was real data, but knew that we need to do something to really address it. But one of those issues that we found, and we find with a lot of those discussions, is trust, right? There's this kind of loss of trust between residents, between institutions, between the local government. We've seen that play out kind of on the national stage. Raphael, do you think there's things, what have you seen maybe that either works or things you think we could be doing to just improve some of this trust between some of these groups in Springfield, between residents and institutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I would first start with, we talk about the neighborhood well-being. Several years ago, we started with the downtown revitalization, right? And I think a lot of cities, bigger cities, smaller cities, they look at, we need to restructure our downtown to bring in more outside sources. And they start with this outside approach. And the residents, the neighborhoods sort of feel left out. Like, why are you starting to try to bring outside resources or outside people in when we're still here trying to fit in or find our place, right? Or have been disproportionately left out already, but you're looking to bring in the outside, individuals. And so that's where that trust part comes in, the communication. It's oftentimes we go into these board meetings and these situations and we're like, we'll just give them this and they need this and we've noticed this. And it's like, well, who did you get that information from? Who did you gather it from? Were you talking to the residents? Were you knocking on doors? And oftentimes you'll be like, no, like we're the experts. We went to school for this, or, we've kind of encapsulated into that process. And it's like, well, you're not the experts on it. The residents are, right? The people that's living, breathing in that experience on a day-to-day basis. Those are the experts that can give you that intel that you need to make that community, to make that neighborhood a thriving area. And oftentimes that gets lost, in the process. And that's where you get that trust division, from city governments, even from neighbor to neighbor. Oftentimes we say, I'm living next to my neighbor, right? It's like, no, I'm living in this neighborhood with my neighbor. And we don't have that with my neighbor aspect of it. And once we get back to that, when we start to have that community connection, where we can go to our next door neighbor and be like, hey, checking on you all just to see how you're doing, we lose that. And that's important to have in neighborhoods and trust.
One of the things that came up with neighborhoods in these discussions was communication. And by that, I mean, communication is maybe the biggest thing that we've been hearing, a lack of communication. And it's not a standalone pillar because we realize it's everything. Every one of the pillars, every one of the discussions we have needs to focus on communication and how we're communicating. But one of the things with neighborhoods is when we talk to people that lived in healthy neighborhoods. And by that, I just mean where neighbors are engaging with each other. They might have a neighborhood association. They're getting together. It just feels like there's some sense of cohesion within a neighborhood of people working together. They were more tuned into what was going on in the community. And we were actually at a factory here in Springfield doing a listening session. And we said, well, how do we reach you? And he's like, oh, you can't reach me. You need to reach my neighbors, basically, and they'll talk to me, which is tough. They're like, well, then we need to talk to your neighbors and figure out, but word of mouth and how important that is. What do you think we could be doing to maybe improve neighborhood communication or how can we use that to really move forward?
Yeah, I think you can start by engaging in the community leaders, right? Locating and identifying the community leaders. It's not, the ones that are presidents and CEOs of these companies or leaderships of these organizations. Sometimes it's just Betty Sue, from down the street, the nosy neighbor, so to speak. And that is, like you talk about word of mouth, that's a very powerful tool when you start looking into neighborhoods, right? And so when you start engaging and implementing and incorporating these these residents that's in the mix into these decision making, that's where you'll start to get the communications to start to flow better. So yeah, it's definitely so.
So David, we've been in a lot of listening sessions, been talking to a lot of people, and then there's the survey data on top of that. But we've been hearing from residents about the challenges they face in quality of life in the place they live. Can you talk a little bit about what we've been hearing from residents?
Yeah, so I think connected to neighborhoods and well-being, there is this disconnect, as you were just talking to Raphael about it, that sort of trust issue, right? And I think that's where, if I look at cities, and I heard this a little in the listening sessions, is that if you take the last decade, right? So a decade ago, cities were investing in neighborhoods. There was a move towards identifying neighborhoods. There was, some sort of programming, to help people connect, as you were saying, Raphael. Mm-hmm. Of course, COVID then sort of threw a curveball in that. And what I'm seeing is a lot of cities are now really going back to the process of starting to think about intentional neighborhood building, bringing that community building to a neighborhood level. Obviously, a period where people were not able to interact was kind of a circuit breaker and programming went away. I think there's a lot of opportunity for that here. And I know Springfield has looked at that in the past, right? And again, followed some sort of a cycle where it didn't gain traction and so on. But this is really community building. And this is about building those person-to-person connections, that sense of familiarity. That's why, actually, we were talking about this earlier in the downtown pillar, why the downtown is a really important part of the social and geographic fabric of this community, because it's a connection point. Mm-hmm. People can go there. In fact, we heard a lot of people talk about the Jazz and Blues Festival being this last year being a really exciting experience, because it brought people from all across the community, sort of non-traditional connections. People came together and enjoyed some events. I think there is a deeper issue here that people talk about in the surveys and in the listening sessions, about this sense of there are different locations, like there's South Side and the North Side, and these sort of areas that has a lot of history, but that there has to be some intentional building connections across that. There's also, I think, a piece here as we get into the roadmap development, which is about making sure that opportunity and success in the future is distributed across the community. Okay. I mean, I think there's a reality here that there are portions of the community who have felt they've been left out of the action for a long time. And I think so, as we think about neighbourhood and we think about economic development and we think about where community infrastructure, public infrastructure goes, we have to have that lens over the top of Springfield to say, okay, how are we using these investments to help foster and give a boost for people's quality of life or their sense of connection at different levels, and different parts of the community will require different things, right? Mm-hmm. So I do think it's a sort of an overlay issue in my mind as we think about planning. But I will see, as we go through the roadmap development, I'll be interested to see how much appetite there is for really intentional community building at a neighborhood level. A lot of things you talked about, Raphael, like get somebody who gets people together and starts people talking and becomes the communication conduit and so on.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, I mean, we look at some of the things that we've been hearing in listening sessions, and just really over the time that I've been here in the Springfield area, working in the Springfield, going to school here, we often hear those, well, I've been around for this many decades and this many listening sessions, and it's talk. It's talk, but there's not enough action that has been produced for you all to gain my trust, nor to circumvent that trust to the next person, right? To my neighbor, right? So instead of me saying, oh yeah, like I was a part of this community session and we talked about action steps that we were going to implement into the community, and then here it is 10 years later, same thing. There has to be a change in what we're doing now. And I think that with the 2051, we are on the verge of doing that. Putting the action behind our words, but doing it in a way that is not just spewing out something just because we need to hurry up and put action out there, right? We want to be intentional. We want to be mindful that the product that we're putting out is going to be beneficial, not only for now, but for the future.
So it's interesting because I think part of it's things not happening, right? And then that lack of trust. But part of it that we found in these sessions is that things were happening.
Yes.
But there was a lack of communication. And there was communication in the beginning, right? In the focus groups, the meetings, even reporting back out to people. But then once a lot of that work happened, the work of and talking's work, right? This is all work, but that next stage of work. there was a lack of communication there. And we had a lot of times where people were like, well, they promised to do this and that never happened. And we're like, well, actually it did happen, but it was a failure on their part to report back. So that's that long-term communication of how do we continue to create dialogue with these residents. And again, the neighborhood level is a really important way of doing that. And we've seen, I mean, there's some really healthy neighborhoods here in Springfield, and I live in one of them. And I can't imagine moving to a different neighborhood. I like my house, and it's not necessarily why I'm there, but the community connection of just knowing that my neighbors are there for me. Regular meetings. We had an incident a couple of years ago, and the neighborhood rallied around. I didn't feel alone. They came together, and there was communication from us to them, and from them back to us, and then their communication with city leaders and bringing them into meetings. It's how things happen, right? Yeah. And I think we need that communication is really, really important.
And that needs to be amplified as well. I mean, it's, in that historic district, we have that, but it needs to be amplified throughout the South Side, throughout not only the South, but the West Side. And I think if we have that, those community, grassroots, community meetings, like, what was it? The neighborhood watches, right? Those were I'm from Michigan, I'm from Detroit. Those were everywhere, and it held accountability throughout the neighborhood, throughout the residents that lived in it. And it made you have that sense of comfort and a sense of connectedness and family. Right. Growing up there, if I got in trouble down the street, I knew that it wasn't so much my mom that I was going to get in trouble by, but it was going to be my neighbor who would discipline me. And that kind of held me in check. That needs to come back. Yeah. When we have that sense, that village, that will spark a new generation.
So you mentioned Southside, and Southside is a pillar on its own. So I don't want to get too deep there. But as we think about neighborhoods and well-being, of course, we've seen American cities, and Springfield in particular, shaped by policies that created unequal opportunities. A lot of those that had their antecedents here, right, with legally segregated housing and redlining and these other policies that decimated community. And you look at these places that don't have community. A lot of them are these places that have had federal policies, a lot of them federal, that have created inopportunity or unequal opportunities today. How, to both of you, do you think we can address those legacies? Because they've come up a lot in the meetings about those legacies, while also planning for the future, right? This came up a lot in our Southside meetings, where there needs to be these discussions on that. We need to talk about these legacies, but we also need to build for the future. How do you think we do that?
Well, I think demonstrating response is one thing, like listening and then doing something, right? And as you say, there's a lot of work to do, and talking is actually a valid action. I will say in this case, we spent a lot of time working with Southside residents, and they expressed a lot of frustration about some of those very long, almost multi-generational senses of aggravation, right? But the steering committee has very intentionally created a pillar that is about the revitalisation of the South Side. So it's actually putting a spotlight on it. It's not neutralising or averaging it into the system. And I think that's really important messaging. And it's not hollow messaging. It's recognising that this is a deep, systemic, societal issue in this community. And when we probe people on what sort of future do they want, people want this to be a united community that celebrates diversity. So if you have a neighbourhood that is feeling left out and has a sense of sort of disadvantage that's been enduring, then addressing that and putting that up as a top priority is a really important step, right? And I think what will come next, obviously, is then working with, in this case, the Southside community to say, well, what action now needs to occur, right? We've made this a priority. We've heard the issues. How do we move the needle forward on this? And then, quite systematically moving through and implementing action. But I think you're dead right about communication being really important. And one of the things we've been doing is looking at past studies that have occurred in Springfield and what came out of those. And what has struck me is that Springfield is a community that knows how to come together in a moment to meet a need, plan, and start to implement. And we talked about this in some of these other podcasts, like the downtown revitalisation. That didn't just magically happen. That was people came together and intentionally worked on that. But this community has demonstrated over and over it has the capacity to be able to do that, has really strong institutions. There are some fantastic philanthropic institutions and organisational institutions. So I think it's about those things coming together and then communicating back to people. Here are the priorities. Here's the action we're taking. Here's the steps. Here's what we've accomplished this year. Here's what our plan is for next year. I think that's going to be a key part going forward.
Yeah. And I mean, we talk about the communication aspect of it, and you say communicating back to the community, but also the community, I think, is just as important to have them in those rooms, right?
Yeah.
To have the people that are, like I said, living, breathing, every day in those communities, to have them at the table to help inform in these decisions that's affecting them and the neighbors surrounding them. So when we do make that decision, it's like, oh, well, we had these set of people that live directly on the South Side, not someone who lived on the South Side, moved away from the community, came back, and they're trying to make a preemptive judgment. No, someone that's actually there today, living it, has generational, history about the South Side and about the history that has gone on and occurred, so that they can make informed decisions. Like I said, so having the lived experience at the tables of decision making.
Can I add to that too? I think there's some really good opportunity for that as well. One of the pillars that's been identified is around the downtown and the corridors, the entrance corridors into the community. And the entrance corridors to me are really interesting because they come in from multiple different directions, and one comes obviously through a very important area, the South Side neighborhood. And so for sure, I can anticipate that we're going to have some deliberate programming which is about reimagining what those corridors could be. And I think that's a really interesting opportunity to reflect the character of the neighborhoods that those corridors are coming through, not just a bland anywhere type of experience, but something that introduces you to some really unique aspects of the history and heritage in this community. Right at the very center of our framework, we have this unique strategic positioning proposition. So that's part of telling the story. So when people come to this community, what are they feeling? What's the story they get told as they move from the interstate into the core of the community? So I think there's going to be some really unique opportunities to be able to reframe and have different conversations with people in neighborhoods about what do they want to see and how does their aspiration and their story get translated into physical manifestations and improvements.
Yeah, and I think we start looking at talking about investing into the South Side. We get city leaders and city government investing into and believing in what the South Side could be or these corridors could be. That is contagious. It builds out, and these neighborhoods start to, have a little bit more pride and, upkeeping in their properties and, holding their neighbors accountable. Hey, get your grass together, right? And that's what you want. You want that sense of pride for not only the South Side, but throughout the Springfield-Clark County area. Yeah. And we have it. It's just, amplifying it.
Yeah.
In your work at the Springfield Foundation, Raphael, have you seen partnerships that you think are making a big difference between, say, nonprofits or schools or businesses? You're around a lot, and maybe this is a tough question because you see so much in the community, but we've been hearing a lot about groups working together. Do you think there's some good examples out there of how this community has bridged some of those divides to work together on some of these issues?
Absolutely. It's, being a part of the foundation and being connected in the community. Again, my title is Director of Community Outreach and Engagement, and, I pride myself on not being behind the computer desk, on a daily basis, but being out and engaged and, seeing what these nonprofits are doing. Oftentimes we see like, oh, well, this organization and this organization are doing similar things, but, they are attacking the issue at root. To make a solution, right? And there is a lot of collaboration happening, and there needs to be more, right? So a lot of good things are happening. It just needs to be amplified. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Oh, good.
Well, can I add one thing to that too? Because I think it would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that the steering committee and the advisory group for Springfield 2051 is exactly that diverse collaboration.
Yeah.
If you look at it, it's got the city, the county, it's got the community foundations, it's got economic development, it's got arts and it's got neighbourhood representation.
Yeah.
It's a really wide cross section, and it really pulls a lot of the social threads together. Now, for sure, it's a steering committee on a planning process, right? And what you're probably referring to is where rubber hits the road, where we get action, right? But action will come out of this because coming out of the framework that we've got to at this stage, our next big phase in this project is going back out to people, say, okay, we've identified these 7 core strategic areas, what we call these strategic pillars. What are the actions we need to be doing? What's our roadmap? What do we need to be doing the first year and the third year and the 5th year? What are the set of the priorities that the community can align to address each one of those key areas, and how do we make sure they continue to reinforce each other? How do we make sure that economic development empowers neighbourhood wellbeing and sense of belonging? And how do we make sure that the economic development is empowering the arts and culture and so on, right? How do we sort of build that synergy and that sort of cross connectivity? Because I think that's part of your secret sauce. Diversity for sure, right? But I think you've got all these strong institutions. If you can couple those together where they're driving each other and creating new levels of innovation and creativity in those different sectors, that's going to be your magic.
And I think also looking into that, being a funder and being connected within the community, oftentimes we hear this word siloed, right? These organizations are operating in silos, and but to go to your point, until we start to build that collaboration to a wider scale, solutions will happen more often, right? If you're operating over here, but you don't want to work with another organization, that's just going to create more of a divide, right? So when we start to collaborate, when we start to see more of that collaboration, especially when we start talking about the pillars, we're going to need all hands on deck, right? And we're going to have to work in cohesion with each other to make it happen.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this discussion. This has been really, really just wonderful. So thank you again for joining me. This is such an important pillar. We have a lot of work to do, and I'm glad, Raphael, to be working with you on this. And David, thank you for all of your help.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us for this podcast. And stay tuned for upcoming podcasts focused on our 7 pillars, focused on where we're taking our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Let's Make History Together podcast. You can visit letsmakehistorytogether.com for more episodes. You may also check out springfield2051.com to learn how you can get involved in the process of shaping our community's future. Special thanks to our guests and to you, our listeners and fellow community members. The music excerpt used for this podcast is by Johnny Lytle, one of Springfield's legendary music stars.